Hey everybody, I am PinkDraconian. By day, I'm a penetration tester, and by night, I do bug bounty, CTFs, hack the box, everything you can think of. And recently, I've been hacking a lot on the Hunter platform, and I've found a couple of really interesting vulnerabilities. And today, I wanted to share one of them with you. And this is a remote code execution via a cross-site request forgery. Now, for those of you that don't know what cross-site request forgery is, let's really quickly delve into it. So you have a user who is logged in on a vulnerable website, or a user that can connect to a vulnerable website, and an attacker wants to perform an action on that vulnerable website in the name of the victim. So what does the attacker do? They create a website like attacker.com, and on that website, whenever a victim visits it, the website is going to use the browser of the victim to make a request to the vulnerable website to change something like an email address here. And that is a cross-site request forgery. But the vulnerability is a remote code execution via a CSRF. How is that possible? Because, well, you can only kind of force the victim into making requests to a specific library. Well, in this case, the lollms-webui package that this vulnerability is in, they have a specific endpoint /execute code. Now, that may seem very weird. Why would a package have an endpoint called execute_code? It does exactly what you think it does. If you send it some code, it's going to execute that code. And it may sound like a really bad idea to have such such an endpoint in your package, but you kind of have to understand the perspective of this is a package that is only expected to run on local hosts, for example, where everybody is trusted. So this may be a good idea, or not. That's another discussion. But in itself, this endpoint is not really a vulnerability, or a vulnerability with a very low CVSS score, because obviously you need to be on the local host of the victim to actually exploit it. So not really interesting on its own. But what is interesting is that this is a post request that requires some JSON. As you can see from the snippet here, the content type can be text/plain. It doesn't need to be application/JSON. There's also no cookies required to kind of execute this call. So what if we make this call from an attacker website? So we create an attacker website, and the attacker website hosts a page like shown here. You have a form, and that form will then perform the action with a post call, and then has as the input the JSON code that needs to be sent. And this will have as the content type the text/plain. And this is accepted by the application. So this means that if a victim that has the lollms-webui running opens a link to attacker.com hosting this HTML, then arbitrary code will be executed on the victim machine, and the attacker can take over that machine, kind of making this endpoint that is not a great idea in itself, but not really a huge issue, into a huge issue because of these reasons. And I think this is kind of, when we're talking about bug bounty in the AI space, there's a lot of things where you might say, well, is it a vulnerability? Is it not a vulnerability? You have a lot of packages that maybe have vulnerable code in them, but doesn't use that vulnerable code. Or in this case, where the package maintainer expects the code to only, or expects the package to only be run on local host and to never be exposed. So always try to kind of think about how you can make your finding as impactful as possible. And it's definitely still possible to get really impactful bugs. So always try to focus on that. Think about how an attacker could actually misuse it in the grand scheme of things. And it's also all right to report things that are smaller. Like you could report this execute_code endpoint on its own with a low severity, probably, because in the CVSS scoring, you're going to have to select local. So it's probably going to be low. That is also fine, but in this case, it was very, very simple to kind of escalate it to a high severity vulnerability. So always try to do things like that. And with libraries that are hosted on localhost, always try to see if a CSRF is possible, because it's definitely not a dead vulnerability class just yet. But that's all I kind of wanted to show you today. Have a great day, and see you in another one.